Well, it appears that there's de-dollarization starting in Europe. Emmanuel Macron of France says Europe, the whole of Europe that is, the European Union, he's not talking just for himself. He says Europe should reduce dependence on the US dollar and seek strategic autonomy. I guess he's noticed that the Russia, China, and BRICS members and associates are doing much better economically. Now, as the United States combats the recent flood of countries de-dollarizing, trading commodities in other currencies, the last thing that was needed was French President Emmanuel Macron amplifying this whole message for Europe. Now, after spending around 6 hours with Chinese President Xi Jinping as part of a 3-day stay visit to China, Macron made extremely clear that France wants nothing to do with World War III, emphasizing that Europe must employ strategic autonomy, presumably led by France to become a third superpower, according to Politico. While speaking with reporters abroad, Cotam Unité, France Air Force One, the French president said that the great risk facing Europe right now is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevent it from building a strategic autonomy. This is not the first time Macron has suggested reducing dependence on the US. In November, the French president called for a single global order while discussing the power interests of Russia and China and the threat of war. He said, "We're in a jungle and we have two big elephants trying to become more and more nervous. If they become very nervous and start a war, it will be a big problem for the rest of the jungle. You need the cooperation of a lot of other animals, tigers, monkeys, and so on," he said, as an example, of course. China agrees, of course. Macron's concept of strategic autonomy was enthusiastically endorsed by Xi Jinping and China, who have been focusing on the notion that the West is in decline while China rises, and that weakening the transatlantic relationship will accelerate this trend. The paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we believe we are just America's followers, Macron said. The question Europeans need to answer is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis in Taiwan? No, he says. The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US agenda and the Chinese overreaction. Just hours after his flight left Guangzhou, heading back to Paris, China launched large military exercises around the self-ruled island of Taiwan, which China claims as its territory, but the US has promised to arm and defend. US. Those exercises were a response to the Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen 10-day diplomatic tour of Central American countries that included a meeting with Republican US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy while she transited in California. People familiar with Macron's thinking said he was happy China had at least waited until he was out of Chinese airspace before launching the simulated Taiwan encirclement exercise. Macron's submissive statements come after he and Xi Jinping intensely discussed Taiwan, according to French officials who accompanied the president. So that being said, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who accompanied Macron, said she stressed stability in the region, telling Xi Jinping during their meeting last Thursday in Beijing that the threat of use of force to change the status quo is unacceptable. According to the report, Xi Jinping responded by calling anyone who thought they could influence China on Taiwan was deluded. Xi Jinping said Europeans cannot resolve the crisis in Ukraine. How can they credibly say on Taiwan, watch out, if you do something wrong, we will be there? If you really want to increase tensions, that's the way to do it, he said. According to Yanmei Chi, the geopolitics analyst at Gavike Dragonomics, Europe is more willing to accept a world in which China becomes a regional hegemon. Some of its leaders believe such a world order may be more advantageous to Europe. During Xi's trilateral talks with von der Leyen and Macron on Thursday, the Chinese leader became upset over two things. Xi Jinping was visibly annoyed for being held responsible for the Ukraine conflict and he downplayed his recent visit to Moscow, said one source who was present in the room. He said he was clearly enraged by the U.S. and very upset over Taiwan, by the Taiwanese president's transit through the U.S., and the fact that foreign policy issues were being raised by Europeans. In this meeting, Macron and von der Leyen took similar lines on Taiwan. This person said, but Macron subsequently spent more than 4 hours with the Chinese leader, much of it with only translators present, and his tone was far more conciliatory than von der Leyen's when speaking with journalists. Now is it time to ditch the dollar? Macron suggests that Europe was too dependent on the United States for weapons and energy and must now focus on boosting their own defense industries. But perhaps most notable was the suggestion that Europe needs to reduce its dependence on extraterritoriality of the US dollar, a line which both Moscow and Beijing, of course, have been emphasizing. If the tensions between the two superpowers heat up, we won't have time nor the resources to finance our strategic autonomy, and we will become vassals, he said. Russia, China, Iran, and other countries have been hit by US sanctions in recent years that are based on denying access to the dominant dollar-denominated global financial system, the dominant dollar. Some in Europe have complained about weaponizing of the dollar by Washington, which forces European companies to give up business and cut ties with third world countries or face crippling secondary sanctions. And while sitting in the stateroom of his A330 aircraft in a hoodie with the words French tech emblazoned on the chest, Macron claimed to have already won the ideological battle on strategic autonomy for Europe, according to Politico. Meanwhile, an interesting footnote: as is common in France and many other European countries, the French president's office, known as the Élysée Palace, insisted on checking and proofreading all the president's quotes to be published in this article as a condition of granting the interview, and this violates Politico's editorial standards and policy, but they agreed to the terms in order to speak directly with the French president, and Politico insisted that it cannot deceive its readers and would not publish anything the president did not say. The quotes in the article were all actually said by the president, but some parts of the interview in which the president spoke even more frankly about Taiwan and Europe's strategic autonomy were cut out by the Élysée. And this is by Zurich Tyler Durden. So what do you think about this? So he's talking about Europe. He went with Ursula von der Leyen, and obviously it looks as if the wind is blowing towards BRICS and away from the US dollar. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box.